On January 2nd, 1905, after 329 days of siege, the Russian commander at Port Arthur raised the white flag. 32,000 Russian soldiers marched into Japanese captivity. The fortress that was supposed to be impregnable had fallen, but this was not just a military defeat. It was the beginning of an avalanche that would bury the Russian Empire. Within 3 weeks, Russian workers would be massacred in St. Petersburg streets. Within 5 months, Russia's Baltic fleet would be annihilated in the Tsushima Strait. Within 10 months, the Tsar would be forced to sign away his absolute power. The empire that had expanded for 4 centuries was collapsing in a single year. And Russia was not the only empire trembling. 1905 was the year the old order discovered it was mortal. Every assumption that had sustained imperial power for centuries was shattered. A European empire could be defeated by an Asian nation. Workers could paralyze a country with strikes. Battleships that took years to build could be destroyed in hours. Absolute monarchs could be forced to share power. The weapons that had conquered the world could no longer maintain control of it. From the frozen streets of St. Petersburg to the warm waters of Tsushima, from the conference rooms of Portsmouth to the chanceries of Berlin, the message was clear. The age of imperial invincibility was over. The age of revolutionary possibility had begun. What happened in 1905 was not just the end of a war or the beginning of a revolution. It was the first crack in the dam that would burst in 1917, sweep away 4 empires by 1918, and drown the old world in blood. The siege of Port Arthur had lasted longer than the American Civil War. When it ended on January 2nd, 1905, it did not just hand Japan a fortress. It handed them the key to destroying Russian prestige, Russian confidence, and ultimately, the Russian monarchy itself. General Anatoly Stosel's decision to surrender seemed inexplicable. The fortress still had 23,000 combat-capable troops, 3 months of food, and adequate ammunition. The Japanese had lost 60,000 men trying to take it, nearly 3 times the Russian casualties. By every military calculation, Port Arthur could have held out until spring. But Stoessel was not calculating military factors. He was calculating political ones. Every day Port Arthur held meant another day the Baltic fleet steamed closer, a fleet everyone knew was sailing to its doom. Every day meant more Russian soldiers dying for a war nobody in Russia wanted anymore. Every day meant the revolution brewing at home grew stronger. When Stoessel raised the white flag, Russian officers wept. Some shot themselves rather than endure the shame. In St. Petersburg, the War Ministry court-martialed Stoessel in absentia and sentenced him to death, later commuted to 10 years in prison. But Stoessel may have been the only Russian commander who understood the truth. The war was already lost. Prolonging it would only increase the price. Port Arthur's fall freed 90,000 Japanese troops to march north toward Mukden. It released the Japanese fleet from blockade duty to prepare for the Baltic fleet's arrival. Most importantly, it shattered the myth of Russian military competence that had sustained the Tsar's authority. In the Russian army, officers began questioning orders. If Port Arthur could fall, what else might be wrong with their leadership? If Japanese soldiers could defeat Russians, what did that say about racial hierarchies? If the government had lied about Port Arthur's strength, what else were they lying about? The questions spread like cracks in ice. Each doubt weakened another certainty. By the time the news reached St. Petersburg, the ice was ready to shatter completely. Just 20 days after Port Arthur fell, a Russian Orthodox priest named Father Georgy Gapon led 150,000 workers and their families toward the Winter Palace. They carried icons, sang hymns, and held a petition asking the Tsar, their little father, for an 8-hour workday, better wages, and an end to the war. They believed Nicholas II would listen to his suffering children. Instead, he ordered his soldiers to shoot them. The march wasn't revolutionary, it was religious. The workers wore their Sunday best. They brought their wives and children. They carried portraits of the Tsar and sang, "God Save the Tsar," as they walked. Their petition began, "Sire, we, working men of St. Petersburg, our wives and children, our helpless old parents, come to you to seek justice and protection." Father Gapan, who led them, was actually a police agent, part of a government program to control workers through approved unions. But Gapan had come to believe in the workers' cause. He genuinely thought that if the Tsar only knew how his people suffered, he would act to help them. The government knew the march was coming. They had positioned 10,000 soldiers at strategic points throughout the city. The Tsar himself had left for his palace at Tsarskoye Selo, 20 miles away. He would not soil his hands with what was about to happen. At 2 p.m. on January 22nd, the crowds reached the Narva Gate. An officer ordered them to disperse. When they continued forward, singing hymns, the soldiers opened fire. The first volleys dropped dozens. The crowd could not believe it. Surely this was a mistake. They kept walking. The soldiers kept shooting. At the Winter Palace, another column met the same fate. Cavalry charged with sabers drawn. Infantry fired volleys into the packed masses. Children were trampled in the panic. Women were shot trying to protect their husbands. The official count was 130 dead and 299 wounded. Actual casualties were likely over 1,000. But the real casualty was the myth of the benevolent Tsar. For centuries, Russians had believed that the Tsar was their protector, that he cared for them like a father. If there were problems, it was because of corrupt ministers keeping the truth from him. Bloody Sunday destroyed that illusion forever. The Tsar had ordered his soldiers to shoot his people. The father had murdered his children. Within days, 400,000 workers were on strike in St. Petersburg. Within weeks, strikes spread across the empire. In Poland, workers battled police in the streets. In Finland, a general strike paralyzed the Grand Duchy. In the Caucasus, Armenians and Azeris began killing each other as imperial authority collapsed. The empire that had seemed eternal in 1904 was disintegrating in 1905, and it had begun with a priest leading workers to ask their father Tsar for help. While Russia was bleeding internally from Bloody Sunday, it was hemorrhaging externally at Mukden. From February 20th to March 10th, 600,000 men fought across a front stretching 90 miles, larger than Gettysburg, Waterloo, and Austerlitz combined. It was industrialized warfare on a scale that made previous battles look like skirmishes. It was a preview of the apocalypse coming in 1914. The numbers were staggering. Russia deployed 330,000 men, 1,475 guns, and 56 machine guns. Japan fielded 270,000 men, 1,062 guns, and 200 machine guns. For 3 weeks, they poured steel and lead into each other across frozen Manchurian plains. The artillery barrages lasted days. Japanese guns fired 20,000 shells daily. Russian batteries responded with 15,000. The sound could be heard 50 miles away, a continuous thunder that never stopped. Soldiers went deaf. Horses went mad. The earth itself seemed to shake apart. Machine guns created kill zones 1,000 yards deep. Infantry attacks gained ground in meters, not miles. Both sides dug trenches, strung barbed wire, and settled into positional warfare. It looked exactly like what would happen in France 9 years later, but European observers dismissed it as Oriental inability to maneuver. Japanese Marshal Oyama Iwao executed a massive double envelopment, attempting to surround the entire Russian army. It was Kane on an industrial scale. For days, the battle's outcome hung in balance. Russian commander Kuropatkin had more men, more guns, and interior lines. He should have won. But Russian command had rotted from within. Orders took hours to reach units. Generals refused to support each other. Supply trains arrived at the wrong positions. Ammunition ran out in critical sectors while warehouses 10 miles away overflowed. The Russian army wasn't defeated. It dissolved. On March 10th, Kuropatkin ordered a retreat. It became a rout. The Russians fell back 90 miles, abandoning Mukden, losing 90,000 casualties, surrendering 20,000 prisoners and 58 guns. The Japanese had won the largest land battle in history, but at a cost, 70,000 casualties they couldn't afford. Every general staff in Europe studied Mukden obsessively. They saw the scale, the casualties, the deadlock. They saw trenches, barbed wire, and machine guns creating stalemate. They saw that modern weapons made offensive warfare almost impossible, and they learned nothing. German observers concluded that Russian incompetence caused the stalemate. French analysts decided Japanese success proved that offensive spirit could overcome defensive firepower. British experts believed that better training would restore mobility. They were all wrong. Mukden showed exactly what the Western Front would become: an industrial meat grinder where courage meant nothing and artillery meant everything. This set up a tactical deadlock in World War I, leading to Verdun and the Somme, and marking the end of Romantic warfare. The Russian Baltic Fleet had sailed 18,000 miles to reach the Tsushima Strait. It had taken 8 months, circumnavigating Africa because Britain would not allow passage through Suez. On May 27, 1905, after all that distance and time, the fleet would be annihilated in 6 hours. It remains the most decisive naval battle in modern history, and it revolutionized how every navy would think about warfare. Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky knew his mission was hopeless. His fleet was a collection of obsolete battleships, unreliable cruisers, and auxiliary vessels converted from merchant ships. His crews had never trained together. His officers spoke 3 different languages. His newest battleships had design flaws that made them unseaworthy in rough weather. The voyage itself was a nightmare. At Doggerbank in the North Sea, Russian ships fired on British fishing trawlers, mistaking them for Japanese torpedo boats, nearly triggering war with Britain. At Madagascar, tropical diseases killed hundreds of sailors. At Cam Bay, the fleet waited 2 months for reinforcements, slowly rotting in the tropical heat. By the time they reached Tsushima, the Russian sailors were exhausted, demoralized, and certain of death. They were right. Admiral Togo Heihachiro had spent months preparing. He knew exactly where the Russians would appear, as they had to pass through Tsushima to reach Vladivostok. He had drilled his fleet relentlessly in a single maneuver, crossing the T, where his line of battleships could fire full broadsides, while the Russians could only use their forward guns. At 1:55 p.m. on May 27th, Togo executed the most dangerous maneuver in naval warfare, a turn in sequence that exposed each ship to concentrated fire. For 15 minutes, Russian guns had perfect targets. They missed. Japanese fire control, using new rangefinders and centralized targeting, was revolutionary. They hit with their third. Salvo. The Russian flagship Knyaz Suvorov burst into flames. The battleship Oslabya capsized. The Alexander III rolled over. The Borodino exploded. In 6 hours of daylight battle, Japan sank 6 Russian battleships. After nightfall, torpedo boats sank 2 more. By morning, the Russian fleet had ceased to exist. The final tally was apocalyptic. 21 of 38 Russian ships were sunk or captured. 4,380 were dead. 5,917 were prisoners. Japanese losses included 3 torpedo boats and 117 dead. It was the most lopsided naval victory since Trafalgar, but its implications went far beyond the immediate result. Every navy in the world took 3 lessons from Tsushima. First, speed and gunnery mattered more than armor. Second, wireless communication and coordinated fire control were essential. Third, and most important, the age of close-range naval combat was over. Future battles would be fought at ranges where individual courage meant nothing and technology meant everything. Within months, Britain would launch HMS Dreadnought, designed specifically around Tsushima's lessons. Germany would accelerate its naval program. America would begin its Great White Fleet. The naval arms race that would help cause World War I started in the Tsushima Strait. By October 1905, the Russian Empire had stopped functioning. The Trans-Siberian Railway was on strike. The telegraph system was dead. Factories were closed. Schools were empty. Even the Imperial Ballet had walked out. The empire that had crushed Napoleon was being brought to its knees by its own people refusing to work. Tsar Nicholas II had two choices: massacre or compromise. On October 17th, he chose compromise. He would spend the next 12 years regretting it. It began with typesetters in St. Petersburg demanding to be paid for punctuation marks. Within days, it became the first general strike in history. Railway workers joined first, paralyzing the empire's circulation system. Then factory workers, then shop clerks, then lawyers, then doctors. Even the corps de ballet of the Mariinsky Theater struck, refusing to perform Swan Lake for the aristocracy while Russia burned. By October 15th, 2 million workers were on strike. St. Petersburg had no electricity, no trams, no newspapers. Moscow was cut off from the rest of the empire. In the countryside, peasants were seizing land and burning manor houses. In the military, entire units were mutinying. Count Sergei Veit, the Tsar's ablest minister, presented the situation bluntly. He said either grant a constitution or prepare for civil war. Nicholas wanted to fight. His uncle, Grand Duke Nicholas, drew his revolver and threatened to shoot himself in the Tsar's presence if a constitution was not granted. Faced with this theatrical gesture, the Tsar capitulated. The October Manifesto promised everything Russian liberals had dreamed of: freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion. It promised an elected parliament, the Duma, with real legislative power. It promised that no law could be enacted without the Duma's consent. When the manifesto was published, crowds celebrated in the streets. Students sang the Marseillaise. Workers embraced soldiers. For a brief moment, Russia seemed to have achieved a peaceful revolution. The autocracy that had ruled for centuries had voluntarily surrendered its absolute power. It was an illusion. Nicholas II never intended to keep his promises. In his diary he wrote, "There is no constitution. I have merely granted certain liberties under duress which I shall withdraw when able." Within months he was doing exactly that. The first Duma was dissolved after 73 days for being too radical. The second lasted 103 days. Electoral laws were rewritten to ensure conservative majorities. The promised freedoms were steadily restricted. By 1907, the autocracy had largely restored itself. But something fundamental had changed. The Tsar had admitted he was not absolute. He had shown he could be forced to compromise. The mystique of autocratic power, the idea that the Tsar ruled by divine right, was broken forever. When the next crisis came in 1917, everyone would remember that the Tsar had surrendered once before. While Russia was imploding and Japan was triumphing, Kaiser Wilhelm II decided to test the Entente cordiale that Britain and France had signed the previous year. On March 31st, 1905, he landed at Tangier and declared his support for Moroccan independence. He thought he was calling France's bluff. Instead, he was rehearsing World War I. Wilhelm's calculations seemed logical. France claimed influence over Morocco, but Morocco was still technically independent. Germany had commercial interests there. If Wilhelm championed Moroccan independence, he could humiliate France, prove German power, and maybe crack the new Anglo-French friendship. On March 31st, Wilhelm rode a white horse through Tangier's streets, nearly falling off because the horse was skittish and the Kaiser had a withered arm. He declared Germany would support the Sultan's independence and demanded an international conference to settle Morocco's status. It was theater, but dangerous theater. France was initially prepared to fight. The French army mobilized 100,000 troops on the German border. The French Navy prepared for war, but Prime Minister Maurice Rouvier calculated that France could not fight Germany alone. Everything depended on whether Britain would support France. Britain's position was legally ambiguous. The Entente Cordiale was not a military alliance, it was just an understanding. Britain had no obligation to defend France. But British Foreign Secretary Lord Lansdowne made the strategic calculation. If France was humiliated now, so they saw it, Entente would collapse, and Germany would dominate Europe. Britain backed France diplomatically. The Royal Navy was quietly positioned to support the French fleet. Most importantly, British and French military staffs began secret conversations about how British troops could be deployed to France if war came. These conversations would continue for 9 years, creating the plans that would send the British Expeditionary Force to France in 1914. The International Conference convened at Algeciras, Spain, in January 1906. Germany expected to isolate France diplomatically. Instead, Germany found itself isolated. Britain backed France completely. Russia, despite its weakness, supported France. Italy, supposedly Germany's ally, sided with France. Even the United States backed France. Only Austria-Hungary supported Germany. The conference was a diplomatic disaster for Germany. France's position in Morocco was confirmed. Germany gained nothing except the humiliation of public isolation. But the real significance was what it revealed. The alliance blocs that would fight World War I were already formed. The Algeciras Conference was a diplomatic dress rehearsal for 1914. In December 1905, First Sea Lord Jackie Fisher made a decision that would transform naval warfare and help cause World War I. He authorized construction of HMS Dreadnought, a battleship so revolutionary that it instantly made every other warship obsolete, including Britain's own fleet. It was strategic genius and strategic madness combined. Fisher had been planning an all-big gun battleship for years, but Tsushima proved its necessity. The battle showed that future naval engagements would be fought at long range where only the biggest guns mattered. Mixed caliber armament, the standard design with various sized guns, was useless. At long range, you could not tell which guns were hitting, making fire control impossible. Dreadnought would carry 10 12-inch guns, all of identical caliber. It would have turbine engines for unprecedented speed. It would be armor-plated with the latest Harvey steel. It would cost £1,800,000, more than many nations' entire naval budgets. And Fisher would build it in just 1 year. When Dreadnought was launched in February 1906, every navy in the world faced a crisis. Their existing battleships, which they had spent decades building, were now worthless. In the new naval arithmetic, only dreadnoughts counted. Britain had one. Everyone else had 0. Germany immediately laid down 4 dreadnoughts of its own. But this created a new problem. Germany could never catch up to Britain's existing fleet advantage in pre-dreadnoughts, but in dreadnoughts, everyone was starting equal. Britain had thrown away its overwhelming naval superiority to gain a temporary technological edge. The naval race that followed consumed both nations. By 1914, Britain had 29 dreadnoughts. Germany had 17. The cost nearly bankrupted both empires. The British welfare state was curtailed to pay for battleships. German social programs were cut to fund the fleet. The money spent on dreadnoughts could have built thousands of schools or hospitals. Instead, it built floating fortresses that would fight one inconclusive battle at Jutland. Fisher thought Dreadnought would make Britain so powerful that no one would dare challenge it. Instead, it made everyone desperate to build their own. The ship designed to ensure British naval supremacy actually triggered the arms race that threatened it. By making all existing navies obsolete, Dreadnought created a moment when naval power could be rapidly shifted. Nations that could never have challenged Britain's centuries-old fleet could now compete in building new dreadnoughts. It was like declaring that all previous money was worthless and everyone would start with the same amount of new currency. 1905 changed what was possible. Before 1905, European empires were invincible, Asian nations were inferior, absolute monarchs were divinely ordained, and naval supremacy was permanent. After 1905, all of these certainties were shattered. Japan had proved that European empires could be defeated totally, not just checked or resisted, but annihilated. The Battle of Tsushima was not just a naval victory, it was the destruction of the myth of white supremacy that underpinned the entire colonial system. Every colonized people from Egypt to India to Indochina took notice. Russia had shown that even the most absolute autocracy could be forced to compromise. The October Manifesto proved that czars were not gods, but men who could be pressured, who could be afraid, who could surrender. When revolution came again in 1917, everyone would remember that the Tsar had yielded before. The Moroccan Crisis revealed that the alliance systems were already in place for a general European war. The sides were chosen. The plans were being made. The staffs were talking. All that remained was the spark. The dreadnought demonstrated that technological revolution could instantly overturn centuries of accumulated advantage. Britain's 300-year naval supremacy could be challenged by any nation with enough money and steel. The permanent hierarchies of power were no longer permanent. Most ominously, Mukden had shown what the next great war would look like. Massive fronts, million-man armies, industrial slaughter, and tactical stalemate. The European observers who dismissed it as Oriental incompetence were watching their own future and refusing to see it. The revolutionaries, reformers, and nationalists of 1905 thought they were creating a better world. The workers who marched on Bloody Sunday wanted bread and dignity. The Japanese at Tsushima wanted respect and security. The Tsar who signed the October Manifesto wanted to preserve his throne. They all succeeded in their immediate aims and failed in their ultimate ones. Because 1905 did not resolve the contradictions tearing the world apart, it intensified them. Every empire was weakened but not destroyed. Every revolutionary movement was encouraged but not satisfied. Every military was modernizing for the last war while the next one was taking shape. The result was not peace or progress. It was an unstable equilibrium, waiting for the slightest push to collapse. That push would come in Sarajevo in 1914. But the avalanche it triggered had already been set in motion in 1905, when the world discovered that empires could fall, revolutions could succeed, and the impossible could become inevitable. The old order had begun to die in 1905. It would take another 13 years of agony before it finally expired. For 20 years, German strategy had depended on